The process of production of capital. Part 2. The transformation of money into capital. In Part 1, we looked at the simple circulation of commodities and money. In this part, we're going to look at the transformation of money into capital. I want to begin by pointing out that there's an important distinction between hoarding money and accumulating it. A hoard, described in Chapter 3 of Volume 1, is a technical term for a sum of money of a fixed magnitude which isn't being exposed to circulation. Capitalists don't just hold on to large sums of money which they keep for a rainy day. What they do is spend money with the specific purpose of getting more of it back, and the technical term Marx uses when money is used in this way is advanced. When money is advanced rather than spent, in other words, when it's thrown into circulation in order to get more of it back, we say that the money is functioning as capital. The distinction between advancing money and spending it will be helpful to understand some of the processes that will be explained in Volume 2. Marx says in Chapter 4, the first distinction between money as money and money as capital is nothing more than a difference in their form of circulation. For example, consider how we survive under capitalism as workers. We sell a commodity, our labour power, to a boss in exchange for a wage. We then spend that money on food, necessities, toilet roll, whatever. So we sell a commodity in exchange for money with which we then buy another commodity. That process can be abbreviated to CMC. That process makes sense insofar as the commodities are qualitatively different. You start with one use value and you end with a different use value. It's a sale followed by a purchase. Now, as we'll see, the use value of labour power in particular is a special kind of use value, but for the minute, simply observe the fact that in the form of circulation considered abstractly, you get one use value for another. But what about the inverse form of movement, a purchase followed by a sale? If I sell a commodity at the same price that I bought it, what would be the point in the transaction? Marx writes, it is evident that the circulatory process MCM would be absurd and empty if the intention were, using this roundabout route, to exchange two equal sums of money. The ultimate product of commodity circulation is money, and the goal is to get more of it, and hoarding doesn't give you an increasing amount of money, it's just a sum of money of a fixed magnitude. From the capitalist perspective, what they're interested in is accumulation. They need to advance a sum of money in order to get more of it back. The general formula for capital is therefore MCM-. Money, commodity, money dash. And the dash stands for surplus value. At first glance at that formula, you might think that a capitalist could go on their quest to accumulate by buying a commodity and then selling it above how much it cost them. Swindling, basically. But there are a number of problems with this. First of all, theoretically in free market language, you would need to conceal from the consumer the fact that you've purchased that commodity at a certain price in order to then sell it at a higher one. In other words, as soon as the consumer finds out that they could get that same commodity from another supplier at a lower price, theoretically, market mechanisms would prevent that. Marx observes that it would be some inexplicable privilege that would allow you to do this. More importantly, swindling cannot be the basis for organised profit-making on the large scale, which is what we're interested in here. Suppose that not only I do it, but someone else buys a commodity only to sell it at a higher price, and someone else, etc. If everybody does this, the relations between the values of the commodities remain the same. In other words, it cancels itself out. I can only get extra value for my commodity by shortchanging people if everyone else doesn't. Marx says, the consistent upholders of the mistaken theory that surplus value has its origin in a nominal rise of prices, or in the privilege which the seller has of selling too dear, assume therefore that there exists a class of buyers who do not sell, i.e. a class of consumers who do not produce. Notice that by dealing with this argument, Marx is going through a kind of process of elimination as to where surplus value comes from. He doesn't just jump straight to exploitation as the only explanation for it. He addresses the other possible factors first. The solution to this problem of whence cometh surplus value consists in this. If we want to end up with more money than we started with, we have to find a special kind of commodity which can create value. Marx says, in order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is hence a creation of value. Marx identifies that commodity as labour power, the capacity for a human being to do work. The fact that the worker is being paid for their capacity to do work and not the work itself is a really important distinction. Marx says that capitalism is technically not slavery because the proprietor of labour power must sell it for a limited period only. In other words, if you were to be a slave, you would sell yourself permanently, not temporarily. Some of us would say that even doing this temporarily, while not being as bad as slavery, is still degrading. Marx, on the other hand, insists that we are, as owners of commodities, equal in the eyes of the law. His analysis is, for buying and selling of labour power to take place, you must treat your labour power as a commodity, and you must avoid renouncing your rights of ownership over it. This is achieved by the temporary nature of the interaction. Marx seems to be saying that, leaving aside the issue of whether wage labour is itself degrading, buying and selling of labour power due to its temporary nature is technically not slavery. Marx also asks what it is that determines the value of labour power. There is a bundle of goods necessary to reproduce the worker, and we can think of the value of the worker's labour power as being determined by the value of that bundle of goods, the means of subsistence, which is again measured in magnitudes of socially necessary labour time. The bundle of goods is not the bare minimum of goods needed to simply keep the worker alive, but what is considered to be the minimum that the worker has to have in a particular capitalist society. Also, there is a historical and moral element to the value of labour power as well, in the sense that what's considered to be the minimum can vary quite a lot. It might vary with the technological development of the society. Class struggle is a major factor in whether the balance of wages versus profits is tipped in favour of the workers or the capitalists. So is the reproduction of the working class as a whole, which is necessary for the capitalist system to continue functioning long term. Let's have a recap over the different stages of the argument that we've been looking at. I said at the beginning of part 1 that Marx's method begins from the real concrete, the world as it presents itself to us, and through the process of abstraction, the intellectual activity of breaking the whole down into the mental units with which we think about it, arrives at the thought concrete, the newly understood whole present in the mind. The inescapable situation in which we find ourselves is a situation in which, if we are to survive capitalism, we simply must purchase commodities. To everyday consciousness, commodities appear to have the property of value. Value is determined by the quantity of socially necessary labour time. It is therefore a social relation between people, mediated through objects, which appears as if it is a property of a thing. The concealment of that social relation means that it's not perceptible to everyday consciousness. Commodities all have their values measured in magnitudes of money. Money is the thing that stands for the exchange value of all other commodities. If the laws of the market are left to govern the allocation of resources, all sorts of conditions arise in which people are perhaps incentivized to accumulate money for its own sake. The way that people would go about doing that is not by swindling people, but to find a special kind of commodity which can create value, and that commodity is labour power. When we think of buying commodities, we think of that in terms of our own experiences, buying the stuff we need to live with the wages that we get from selling our labour power. But who's buying that labour power? Someone who's got a different economic mission to us, which is that of accumulating money for its own sake. That's in direct contrast to what we're doing with our money, simply spending it on goods we need to live. The lesson is, in a market economy where mass commodity exchange is the norm, different people are going to relate to money in different ways. What is useful about these opening chapters of Capital? I think it's a very interesting line of reasoning. Apologists for capitalism often say that capitalism is a free market, or is simply what happens when you have a free market. If capitalism were to emerge out of a so-called free market system, and we can certainly conceive of that theoretically, that would be an argument against markets. What I've gotten out of these difficult opening chapters is, it's outlining conceptually how capitalism and all of the class division that is essential to its functioning could theoretically emerge out of a market system without saying that that's what has happened. Marx never says that explicitly, but that's the interpretation that I personally find the most useful, because you can combine that argument with what he says later. Later in this volume, Marx is going to study aspects of the historical emergence of the capitalist system and things like primitive accumulation. Completely unsurprisingly, we're going to find that historically, capitalism did not actually emerge out of a so-called free market system, but out of physical force, and we know that coercion is essential to maintain the capitalist system. With the knowledge of how capitalism can emerge out of a market system, what we can say to the peddler of free market dogma is, let's assume that you're right and that capitalism is just what emerges out of a market system. That would be an argument against markets. As it happens, you're wrong, and capitalism reproduces itself historically by initiating force. These combined arguments are a powerful antidote to free market dogma, and the issue of primitive accumulation will be investigated in a later part. Tune in next time for part 3, which looks at the production of absolute surplus value. Of course, do your bit for our global community. Stay home and stay well. Full solidarity to anyone who's unable to self-isolate due to living in abusive relationships, or if self-isolation means going home to an abusive family. I suggest that people donate to the Swarm Collective, sex worker advocacy and resistance movement, as they're trying to gather a hardship fund for sex workers who are among some of the most economically vulnerable at this time where physical distancing is necessary. You can make a donation at swarmcollective.org/donate. All donations made to Swarm from now to the 30th of April will go directly to this fund and will provide mutual aid to sex workers in the UK who are in severe financial hardship. Stay safe and thanks for watching.